Welcome to our hot topic webinar today. We're going to give it a minute or two and wait till everybody's able to log on. So be patient with us and we will start momentarily. It's nice to see so many people joining us. Over 170 participants already. Welcome to our hot topic program, which stands for Human Origins Today. We're going to wait until everybody's able to log on and connect so you can see the program today. All right, well, I think we're going to get started. So welcome everybody to our monthly hot topic program, which stands for Human Origins Today. My name is Briana Pobiner, and I'm a research scientist, a paleoanthropologist, and an educator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. And I'm really thrilled today to be able to bring to you our hot topic program entitled First Steps, How Upright Walking Made Us Human. I will introduce our speaker and then I'll talk a little bit about I'll talk a little bit about the sort of Zoom logistics of the program. You'll see the Q&A box with like two little speech bubbles either down at the bottom of your screen or maybe at the top of your screen, depending on what device you're using to tune in. So that's where you can post questions to our speaker today. Once the speaker begins his presentation, I will go off camera and I will answer some of those questions as I can potentially during the program, but largely we will leave questions to the end and there will be, out of the hour that we will be together, there will be maybe 20 or 25 minutes at the end for question and answer. So we can't see you or hear you today because this is a webinar format. So I will look at your questions in the Q&A and I will ask the speaker questions verbally and he will answer. It is likely we will not get to all of the questions, but we will do our best. I will now introduce our speaker for this hot topic program. So Jeremy or Jerry DeSilva is an Associate Professor of Anthropology at Dartmouth College. He's a paleoanthropologist specializing in the locomotion of the first apes, hominoids, and early human ancestors, which are hominins. His particular anatomical expertise, the human foot and ankle, has contributed to our understanding of the origins and evolution of upright walking in the human lineage. He has studied wild chimpanzees in Western Uganda and early human fossils in museums throughout Eastern and South Africa. From 1998 to 2003, Jerry worked as an educator at the Boston Museum of Science and continues to be passionate about science education. All right, so I will turn things over now to Jerry, who will share his screen and begin our presentation.
Great. Okay. How are we looking? Screen look good?
Great. Yes,
fantastic.
Great. Take it away.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Thanks, Brianna. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone for tuning in to hear this talk on my passion when it comes to paleoanthropology, which is understanding this really weird form of locomotion that we engage in, and that is upright walking. But I want to start first by having you imagine that you do a Google search for human evolution, right? You Google image human evolution. You're pretty likely to encounter an image like this one, where a knuckle-walking chimpanzee slowly, steadily, linearly evolves into a human. And sometimes these images, which you see on T-shirts and coffee cups and bumper stickers, sometimes they're funny, right? And sometimes they are commentary on modern human behavior, and sometimes they possess racist and sex.
Jerry, you paused and froze for a moment. So can you go back to they sometimes possess racist?
Is that humans evolved from a chimpanzee-like ancestor in this steady, linear kind of fashion. And I'd like to argue today that the scientific evidence we currently have is actually inconsistent with all of those conclusions. So we're going to start with the easiest one to tackle. The idea that all of the differences between, say, humans and chimpanzees, from our body size and the way we walk to our brain size and tooth dimensions, all changed in lockstep. And this we know from the fossil record is simply not correct. Our evolution happened in a mosaic fashion with different features evolving at different times and at different rates. So for instance, this is a graph of human brain evolution. Along the x-axis is time in millions of years, and the y-axis, we have brain size. And every dot represents an individual fossil that has been discovered over the course of the last century. So we have lots of these, lots of fossils of human ancestors and extinct relatives, or what we call hominins, going all the way back to the time of the common ancestor that humans shared with chimpanzees over 6 million years ago. Now note that the brain size of these early human ancestors was about the brain size of a modern chimp, which is shown here in yellow. But then around 3.5 million years ago in the genus Australopithecus, brains get a tad larger, about 20% larger than their predecessors. But it wasn't until about 2 million years ago in the genus Homo that brains really started to take off. So that's what we understand about the brain evolution in human ancestors. Now, one of the things to note too is that some lineages of late occurring hominins, namely Homo naledi and Homo floresiensis, they kind of bucked this trend and retained small brains, or perhaps they even experienced brain reduction from a more encephalized ancestor. Now we can ask whether bipedalism followed the same path. Was our locomotion essentially chimpanzee-like for the first 3 million years or so of our lineage's history? Did Australopithecus dabble with bipedalism a tad and then see it take off with our own genus Homo around 2 million years ago? Well, the answer that we can tell from the fossil record is no. That's not how bipedal evolution unfolded. It didn't happen at the same rate and at the same timing as brain evolution, happened in a mosaic fashion. Instead, the fossil evidence we've collected demonstrates the earliest members of our lineage, going back 4 million, 5 million, 6 million, 7 million years ago, had skeletal adaptations for upright walking. So this form of locomotion is deeply rooted in who we are as hominins. We are the bipedal ape. So bipedalism has made its way into our words, our expressions, our entertainment. Think about the many ways we describe walking. We stroll and stride, we plod and traipse, amble, saunter, shuffle, tiptoe, lumber, tromp, lope, strut, and swagger. After walking all over someone, we might be asked to walk a mile in their shoes. Heroes walk on water, while geniuses are walking encyclopedias. To humanize animated television characters, cartoonists draw them standing and walking on 2 legs. Mickey Mouse, Bugs Bunny, Goofy, Snoopy, Winnie the Pooh, SpongeBob SquarePants, and Brian the dog from Family Guy all walk bipedally. In your lifetime, the average non-disabled person will take over 200 million steps, enough to circle the Earth 3 times. Now, mammals display an extraordinary range of locomotor strategies. There are mammals that fly, swim, sprint, knuckle walk, leap, swing, or just do what this cow is doing, the standard mammalian quadruped. But humans, we're different. We are the only mammals that are fully bipedal. Now, can other mammals do this? Sure. Here is Pedals. Pedals is a bear that frequented the suburbs of New Jersey and often moved on 2 legs. But when other mammals do this, when they move on 2 legs, we are mesmerized. We record it, post it to YouTube, and it goes viral. This particular video I'm showing you here has been watched 4 million times. But when humans move bipedally, it's pretty pedestrian. And yet, it's so crucial to identifying us as a species and as a lineage. It helped start our evolutionary journey, and it even launched us beyond the Earth and into our solar system. But how did this happen? How did humans evolve the ability to move on just 2 legs, and why? Let's return back to this familiar imagery and ask the question of where this came from. So it turns out that this kind of imagery, this march of progress we call it, can be traced back to a foldout in the 1970 Time Life book, Early Man. It was around that time that molecular geneticists were beginning to use similarities in protein structure, and soon after that DNA sequences, to more accurately place humans in the primate family tree. And what they discovered was that the commonly held idea that humans were distantly related to the other apes was wrong. Instead, humans were closely related to the African great apes, and as we now know today, specifically to chimpanzees and to bonobos. Because chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas are all knuckle walkers, it made sense then that the common ancestor would also be a knuckle walker. Otherwise, this peculiar form of locomotion would have evolved in parallel in chimpanzees and in gorillas. And that seemed pretty unlikely. But I'd like to offer the possibility that based on the evidence we have, that's exactly how evolution unfolded. Now, to understand why, we have to understand why chimps knuckle walk in the first place. And to do that, we have to explore an anatomy in our body, the lower back. The lower back of great apes, like chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans, is actually quite short and stiff. And this helps prevent buckling of their backs when they're high up in the trees and bridging from tree to tree. But it also means that they can't extend their torsos over their hips and stand fully upright, like we do. When they stand, they do so in a hunched over manner. And this forces their hips and their knees into a flex posture. Now, humans have longer lower backs. We have more lumbar vertebra. And this allows us to fully extend our torsos over our hips and stand and walk upright. This is energetically a better way to move around on two legs than being crouched over. And if you're unsure about this, bend your knees, bend your hips, and take a few steps around wherever it is you're watching this from, and you'll tire very quickly. You'll see that extended knees, extended hips, again, energetically is the way to go. So the back seems to be pretty crucial to bipedal evolution. But are humans the only primates with long lower backs? Well, it turns out the answer is no. Gibbons and siamongs, the so-called lesser apes, also have long lower backs. And so too do monkeys. But monkeys move around on all fours in a body posture we call pronograde. Apes, on the other hand, can hold their bodies upright in a body posture called orthograde. So we have a bunch of different combinations here in our primate relatives. There are long-backed animals that are pronograde, like our monkeys over here. There are long-backed animals that are more upright, more orthograde, like our gibbon and siamong cousins over here. We have orthograde animals that are short-backed, the great apes, orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees, and bonobos. And so one of the things that we can recognize is that all primates can move every once in a while on two legs. But is one of these body forms, the question I was wondering is, one of these body forms better predisposed to bipedal walking than another? So researchers, of course, have noticed that bipedal locomotion happens in these other apes, and they've tried to quantify how often this occurs. But it's hard because apes are distributed through different forests and on different continents and are being observed by different researchers. So during these COVID times, my undergraduate student, Kyle Rosen, and we saw an opportunity. We reached out to zoos across North America, and we asked them to report on the frequency of bipedal locomotion in their zoo primates. And we thought this was a good time to do it because without visitors to these zoos, the behavior of the animal is not being influenced by the presence or absence of zoo visitors. And instead, we're getting data on what the animal is just sort of naturally going to do. Now, if bipedalism is a predisposed sort of locomotion in an animal that is a knuckle walker, then we should see high frequencies of bipedalism in our bonobos, chimpanzees, and gorillas, and maybe not as much in the others. If instead the hypothesis that bipedalism is a locomotion that evolved from something that was up in the trees, an arboreal biped, which is a commonly held idea, then maybe we would expect to see orangutans and gibbons and siamongs with a greater frequency of bipedalism. Others have posited that maybe bipedalism evolved from something that was indeed pronograde, a long-back pronograde animal. So then maybe we would expect to see higher frequencies in our monkeys, like the animals over here. If instead this is a combination of long-backed orthograde animals that are predisposing you to bipedalism, then maybe we would expect to see this at high frequencies in siamongs and gibbons. So these are data we're still collecting, so these are preliminary results that I'm showing you, but what we're finding is that gibbons and siamongs walk on two legs a lot, and when they do it, they take a lot of steps. Now, the other species will do this, sure, they move on two legs, But more than half of the individuals surveyed, and we got over 400 individuals as part of this survey, they never do walk on two legs at all. And if they do, they don't take many steps. It seems then that having a long back and being orthograde or upright kind of sets the stage for bipedal locomotion. Now, this is not a new idea by any means. Sir Arthur Keith proposed this model over 100 years ago, and the podiatrist Dudley Morton pitched a variant of this in the 1920s. Much more recently, Russ Tuttle at the University of Chicago advocated for such a model of bipedal origins. But bear in mind, evolution doesn't always take the easiest path. Could upright walking in the context of strong selective pressures still have evolved from a short-backed predecessor? Of course. But that's where I think the fossils come in. I mentioned a moment ago that the earliest evidence of bipedalism goes all the way back through 4, 5, 6, 7 million years ago, right to the common ancestor we shared with chimpanzees. But what about before then? What about 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 million years ago? Well, the fossils that we have from that time period are mostly from areas or sites in southern Eurasia, which show that apes once had ranges beyond equatorial Africa in forests hugging the Mediterranean, or what was then what we call the Tethys Sea. Paleontologists have recovered ancient partial skeletons of apes, and they've named them things like Rudopithecus, Hispanopithecus, Pierlopithecus, Oreopithecus, and Danuvius, among many others. But what all these apes seem to have in common is that, like today's apes, they're orthograde, or upright. But unlike the great apes of today, they appear to all have long lower backs, more similar to the condition found in gibbons and in humans. They appear to be predisposed to uprightness. And in the case of Danuvius, which was just discovered and announced last year, they may have even been bipedal in the trees. So the body form from which bipedalism may have evolved then may not have been a chimpanzee-like knuckle walker at all, but more like an upright gibbon-like animal walking in the trees. This then would reverse the march of progress and make knuckle walking the more recently evolved form of locomotion. But it helps to ask the question whether there are other examples of this throughout evolutionary history, where bipedalism was not the end product, really the starting product. And let's start with what is, of course, the most fearsome biped to have ever existed, and that's T-Rex. Did T-Rex evolve bipedalism from a quadrupedal ancestor? Was there a march of progress equivalent for T-Rex? It turns out the answer is no. The earliest dinosaurs were bipeds. They were bipedal. Quadrupedalism, no matter how you arrange the dinosaur family tree, this is sort of contentious right now, quadrupedalism evolved multiple times from a more bipedal ancestor, which eventually then dropped down on all fours. If we go even farther back in time, some of the earliest ancestors and extinct relatives of the modern crocodile and alligator lineage were, in fact, bipedal. We sometimes think of crocodiles as living fossils, but we'd be wrong. Many of their ancient predecessors left us footprints and left us the fossilized remains that show that it at least occasionally moved on two legs. This is a particularly fearsome and impressive animal discovered in North Carolina known as the Carolina butcher. Again, bipedalism was the starting point from which quadrupedalism eventually evolved in these lineages. And I'm suggesting the same may have happened in our own lineage. Now, might I be wrong? Absolutely, and I bet there are colleagues of mine that are vigorously nodding their head right now that I'm wrong about this. Okay, so how would we know? Well, if researchers working in Eastern Africa discover, say, a 9, 10, 11 million year old short-backed hominid with evidence in its wrist and hands for knuckle walking adaptations, then the chimp-like ancestor model is back on the table as a supported and valid hypothesis. And that's the beauty of science, right? New evidence can force us to reconsider old ideas and to change our mind. With such little fossil evidence that we actually have from this critical point in our evolutionary history, we have to remain nimble, able to change our minds should new discoveries demand it. But for now, we are yet to discover such a knuckle-walking ancestor from this time period. And instead, the fossils we do have all point towards a long-backed, upright ancestor, making it possible, and I would say even probable, that knuckle walking evolved independently in chimpanzees and gorillas. Now, think about what that does to our science for a moment. Hundreds of scientific papers have been written to try to explain why our lineage started moving on two legs. There are hypotheses that we evolved bipedalism to carry food and to carry babies. Ideas formulated in the 1940s and popularized in the 1960s posited that our bipedalism evolved to carry weapons, to butcher prey, or even each other. Others have hypothesized that bipedalism evolved to help our ancestors cover long distances, to intimidate, to see over tall grass, to pick low-hanging fruit, to wade through water, to disperse body heat, and so on and so on. Many of these ideas would need to be reassessed in the context of a non-knuckle walking ancestor. For bipedalism would not be a new locomotion that evolved for one or many of these reasons. Instead, it would be an old locomotion co-opted from something moving upright in the trees to a new setting, the ground. The question would need to be reframed. Not why did bipedalism evolve, but why did it persist? And this is a particularly important question for me because bipedalism has significant disadvantages. For instance, humans are exceptionally slow. The fastest human among us, Usain Bolt, ran the fastest any recorded human has ever run during his world record 100-meter dash, and he was clocked at 28 miles an hour. Sounds impressive, and it's not. That's roughly half the speed of a leopard, a lion, a gazelle, or a zebra. At that speed, Bolt couldn't even catch a rabbit. Our ancestors would have had a hard time catching food, and they certainly would have had a hard time running away from becoming food. And the fossils show us indeed that that happened. A decent number of early hominin fossils have bite marks on them that match the teeth of ancient leopards, lions, hyenas, and crocodiles. And furthermore, on our 2 feet, humans are really unstable. We fall a lot. When's the last time you saw a squirrel, a cow, a cat, or a dog just trip and fall? I'm making light of this, but 30,000 Americans and 500,000 people worldwide die from falls every year. As modified apes, our backs, knees, ankles, and feet are vulnerable to injury. And unlike a quadruped, which can still get around, albeit not as well, on 3 legs, human ancestors would have been particularly feeble when they had an injury. One-legged locomotion is not a good option in a world full of hungry predators. And the fossils show that we indeed had injuries. There's a 3.6 million-year-old tibia from Australopithecus afarensis with a healed ankle fracture. There's a 2 million-year-old femur with a healed spiral fracture. Spinal pathologies exist in Lucy and in the Nereocotome Homo erectus skeleton. Our ancestors suffered from many of the same injuries some of us get today. And many of these show evidence of having healed, even in the absence of doctors and hospitals. But despite these downsides of upright walking, and there are lots of them, we're still here. So obviously the benefits of upright walking, from freeing the hands to carry food and babies, and to craft tools, to the energetics of traveling long distances without using too much energy, they must have outweighed the costs of this form of locomotion. But it is a mistake to think of modern human bipedalism as sort of the crowning jewel in the evolutionary story of walking. There were, it turns out, other options. So let's examine this point in our evolutionary history for a moment. This is around, say, 3 to 4 million years ago. At this time, we've got the famous Lucy skeleton of the species Australopithecus afarensis at 3.2 million years old. And there are other partial skeletons. This is a skeleton known as Katanumu from 3.6 million year old sediments, also of Australopithecus afarensis. And we have a few hundred isolated bones and the partial skeleton of juvenile as well. Now, additionally, there are fossilized footprints left by Lucy's kind at the 3.6 million year old site in Tanzania called Ayatollah. There were subtle differences between how they walked and how we walked. They had a flatter arch of the foot, and it looks like they had a little less push off the big toe than we do. But my interpretation of these bones and these footprints is that they had a foot and a walk a lot like ours. The bones and the footprints show that Lucy and her kind walked a lot like we do. However, even this illustration, which kind of portrays that of Lucy walking a lot like we do, is an oversimplification. And it's because it turns out that at any one time in our evolutionary history, there were many ways to walk. In 2010, paleoanthropologists Stephanie Malilo and Johannes Haile Selassie discovered this foot in 3.5 million-year-old sediments in Ethiopia, same age as Lucy and her species. But this foot, which is known as the Bertelli foot, is quite different from the foot of Lucy's species, which is much more like yours and mine. And it demonstrates that at this time in our history, there were at least 2 different species coexisting on the landscape, walking in different ways. So human evolution and bipedal evolution in this particular case, it's much more complicated than a straight line linear path. It's a tangled mess. So let's fast forward now to this time period, 2 million years ago. Well, recently researchers discovered at a cave site known as Dromolen in South Africa, the earliest evidence of Homo erectus at 2 million years. And we know from a fossil skeleton shown here and fossil footprints in Kenya that Homo erectus walked a lot like we do today. Those subtle differences between Lucy's gait and our own were pretty much gone by this time. But just across Sterkfontein Valley, in Malapa Cave, Lee Berger and his team discovered skeletons of a species that lived at that same time, 2 million years ago, called Australopithecus sediba. And its bones were quite different, so much so that we have reconstructed walking in this species to have been different, not only from Homo erectus, but different from other species of Australopithecus and different from the way we walk today. We call it a non-pathological hyperpronatory gait in which this species took short steps and there's more foot and knee rotation than in most humans today. In other words, they were different ways of walking. Even more recently, if we jump ahead to 250,000 years ago, there's evidence for our own species, Homo sapiens, throughout Africa. Homo naledi is in South Africa, Neanderthals are in Eurasia, and the perplexing Homo floresiensis, sometimes called the hobbit, in Indonesia. The bones of these different hominins differ from each other in important ways that tell us that they all walked a bit differently from each other. So for instance, Homo naledi's small joints and flat feet would have prevented it from being the distance traveler that Homo sapiens is today. And Homo floresiensis' large feet may have caused it to walk with more hip flexion, almost like a snowshoer. The variation that we find in foot and leg bones throughout human evolution forces us to recognize that the evolution of upright walking has been less a linear progression and more of a convoluted series of evolutionary experiments. Now, how we represent evolution, and human evolution in this case, it matters. I'm not faulting illustrators who create these images for missing the details. I think these illustrations are really important in engaging people in how science operates and what we know or don't know about human evolution. But like all things in science, these icons should be subject to the same scrutiny and the same revision as we revisit old ideas with new evidence, fresh eyes, and new perspectives. Because it turns out that evolution it's complicated. And our bipedal path was not a simple linear one. It was more complicated and frankly, to me, more interesting than perhaps anyone could have imagined. So thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions. If you want to learn more about bipedalism, I have a book coming out April 6, 2021. It can be pre-ordered right now. And it's of the same title as my talk.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jerry. That was fantastic. And thank you for mentioning your book. So I'm really excited to read it. We do have several questions that are lined up. And
Great.
So I will just jump right in and start with those.
Should I'm going to stop sharing screen.
Perfect. Yes, that's fine.
Yep.
Actually, the first question I'll start with is somebody asked, can I get the name of what type of walk that was again, the one that you mentioned just a few slides before the end of your presentation?
So it's called hyperpronation. Hyper, like an extreme of something, pronation. And pronation is a normal way that our foot operates when we walk. We pronate. And pronate is when you kind of roll the foot towards the big toe. So when we walk, we land on our heel. Usually it's the outside of our heel. So if you look at your shoe, usually it's that back corner that's worn down. And when we land, gravity and both the force of the ground hitting the foot will roll that foot towards the big toe. Is sort of debate on how much your muscles are involved with this as well, and it's probably a little bit of all of this. What we're finding is that in some people, they do this excessively. There's excessive pronation. And so you have lots of rolling of the foot, lots of rolling of the knee. It can affect your hip. It can cause back problems. It can even go right up the chain. And some have hypothesized that it even causes some TMJ problems. And because it's all connected. But what was really fun about Australopithecus sediba, that species that we worked on, that we've hypothesized this gait for, is that it had these strange anatomies, and all of these strange anatomies, or at least many of them, seem to be anatomical solutions to the problems humans have if they walk this way. And so what we argued was that this species was probably adapted for moving in this way. And the reason it did move this way was because it was also, it appears to be a very, very good tree climber. And so if you're going to be climbing trees a lot, going up for safety or for food, then having those adaptations for climbing may affect the kinematics, or the way in which you walk on two legs.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. So here's an interesting question from Claire Schmidt. She asks, why is there such little fossil evidence from the time period in which humans evolved into bipedalism?
It's a great question. I mean, one of the things that I tell my students is that we literally have thousands of fossils of early human ancestors. That the fossil record of humans is rich. Now, we're talking about millions of years, and a million is 1,000,000. So you get 1,000 fossils, you're still dealing with one every 1,000 years. So whenever we find something, it's exciting, and it helps us revisit some of our old ideas. But these fossils aren't laid out sort of in a uniform fashion. There are certain fossil sites that have rocks exposed on the surface of particular ages, and those are the places where we go and find fossils. And so our understanding of human evolution is very clumped, that we know these windows of our evolutionary history, and not only in time, but in place too. Because it's likely that we had the distribution of human ancestors across wider ranges of Africa, but those places are just not good for either fossilization in the first place or recovery of fossils right now. And so I think that that's one of the issues, is that time period, that chunk of, say, 6 to 10 million years, there are some spots where those, there are fossils of that age that exist, and researchers are working really hard to try to find what little bits they can from that time period in our evolutionary history. So what I would tell, the Claire, I think was her name, is stay tuned. That we'll find things. I mean, every year we find more and more and more and more, and I think it won't be long before we have a better sense of what was going on at that time period.
Excellent. I'm going to stay tuned also. So here's a question about a different line of evidence that I think is a great question. This is from, I think, Olivier. What about the foramen magnum, the large hole at the base of the skull, for those species with long backs who were also bipedal? Is it positioned like human centered or offset to the back? Is this position more or less relevant regarding bipedalism than the back length, or do they evolve in sync?
That's an awesome question. And I think right now I'm a fence sitter on this one. I'm not sure the answer to that question. We don't have good skulls from a lot of those taxa that we're talking about to know where the position of the foramen magnum may be. On, say, Danuvius, there's no foramen magnum. Rudopithecus, there's a recent skull reconstruction. I'm trying to think now whether you can infer the foramen magnum position. I don't think there's a cranial base, but somebody should check on that. So for a lot of these fossils that we have, Paralopithecus is another good example. There's this gorgeous face, but no base of the skull. So we can't tell where the foramen magnum was. But there's a debate going on in our science right now about the relevance of the foramen magnum position and whether it is in telling you about locomotion or one of the conflating variables is that species with larger brains actually possess a foramen magnum that tends to be tucked under the skull a little bit more. So there is sort of that conflation of locomotion and brains. And then add to that mix the debates over Sahelanthropus chadensis, which is the 7 million-year-old skull that I showed some figures of. And the interpretation of the skull initially was that the foramen magnum was in a human-like position. But then the critique was, but wait a minute, that skull is pretty crushed. And so maybe if you know, when it's reconstructed, or maybe when you find another one, if you're lucky enough to do so, the foramen magnum maybe has been misinterpreted because of how crushed that skull actually was and distorted. And so they CT scanned it and they reconstructed the different pieces, and sure enough, the foramen magnum appears to be in quite a human-like position. But what I would love to see is more researchers involved in that work, independently reconstructing that skull to see if we all get the same result. Because one of the keys of science is repeatability. And we haven't had an opportunity for repeatability with that particular specimen. And so, yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's a great question. I think there's a lot more that we need to learn about the foramen magnum position as it fits into this sort of suite of features that may have been kind of almost the recipe for bipedalism being a possible form of locomotion.
Excellent, thank you. And I love that message about repeatability. I think that's very important. So here's a question sort of not about bipedalism. And this is from Urate, who's actually one of our volunteers in the Hall of Human Origins. So why did chimps, gorillas, and bonobos evolve knuckle walking? What are the benefits of that,
Yeah.
or what's that about?
So right, okay, assuming this is right, then that's the question, right? The question is why did knuckle walking evolve as a form of locomotion in those lineages? And one of the possible explanations is that if you are a big animal in a tree, right? If you are a large ape in a tree, falling is a problem. So there's a square cubed law where the bigger you get, the larger your volume, but proportionately the smaller your strength to withstand these falls. And it's why squirrels can fall out of trees and kind of be okay. Ants certainly can, but an orangutan, no. So big animals like that are going to evolve long arms, long curved fingers, and short, stiff lower backs to prevent the buckling of the back when they're bridging. And what that means is that if you're big like an orangutan in a tree, well, then you can just sort of move from tree to tree depending on your forest structure. But in an African a tropical forest where food is distributed in a patchier kind of way, then to get from food source to food source, you'd have to come down to the ground. And when you come down to the ground, if you've got a short, stiff lower spine, you're not standing upright unless you're crouched over and doing sort of the Groucho gait, which is energetically expensive. Instead, you got to do something with these arms, right? And you're going to tuck those arms in front of you. And with those long arms and long curved fingers, to prevent the bending of those fingers and the breaking of the metacarpals or the phalanges, you tuck them underneath. And that ends up being the best form of locomotion for these animals. So I think size is important here, and elongation of the arms and the curved fingers. Now, how do we test that? Well, it sure would be nice if we had a good fossil record of chimpanzees and gorillas, and we don't. So when I said we have thousands of fossils of early human ancestors, the same is not true for chimpanzees and gorillas. We have a very weak chimpanzee and gorilla fossil record. And so to me, sort of, what would be my number one wish list item in paleoanthropology would be a Lucy version of a chimpanzee. What did chimps look like 3 million years ago? We don't know. And so what do? We often substitute in just a modern chimp, when I think there's a pretty good chance that chimps have evolved too and have changed quite a bit since that common ancestor. But to test that, we need the fossils, and right now we don't have them. but stay tuned.
Absolutely.
Hopefully we'll
Yes,
have them.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly. Oh, so here's another great question. This is from Avery Borgman. One of the pictures from your PowerPoint showed significant shape differences between human and chimpanzee, I think, pelvies. So I was wondering how that factor is related to bipedalism and lack thereof. For females, does this impact childbirth in any interesting ways?
Absolutely, absolutely. Hold on, I'm gonna get off screen for just 1 second so that
I bet he's
I
getting
can
a
come
pelvis.
back with props, right? I used to work at a
Nice.
science museum, so you always have to have props. Um,
Excellent.
so here's a chimpanzee pelvis, okay? And here's our human pelvis. And these are, roughly the same sized individuals, but look at the chimp. The chimp has a pelvis that has these, what we call ilia, or these blades of the pelvis that are flat, and they're positioned towards the back of the body of the animal. Also, look at how far the distance is between the sacrum up here and the hip joint down here. So it's a very tall pelvis. In humans, what we find is that the pelvis has two major changes. The first is that it's short and it's squat, so that the distance between the sacrum and the hip joint is much reduced. And what that does, it lowers your center of mass. It makes you less sort of wobbly on top, and it reduces any bending forces that are going to be coming through this bone. But the other thing that happens is those flat ilia that you see in chimps and in other apes have curved around to the side of the body. And what that does is it simply repositions your hip muscles so that you can stand on a single leg and not fall over. When chimps stand on a single leg, they do fall over. So when a chimp moves on two legs, it wobbles back and forth, right? And it does that because of its hip musculature, because of the shape of its pelvis. Whereas in humans, when we stand on a single leg, and you can try this yourself, lift your leg, stand on a single leg, and those muscles on the side of your hip contract to keep you from tipping over. Now we can see those very changes of a short, stout pelvis and the muscle attachments moving to the side in Lucy. So this is Lucy's pelvis from over 3 million years ago, and compare her to, say, a chimpanzee, and it's much, much more human-like. It's got those realignments of the muscles and changes to the distance between the sacrum and the hip joints that lowers the center of mass. But what happens then? You lower the center of mass by reducing that distance, you change the shape of the birth canal. So when you change the shape of the birth canal, here, I'll grab this is a chimpanzee, infant head. So this is what a newborn chimpanzee head would look like. And if you try to birth it the way chimpanzees give birth, it doesn't fit at all. So it has to turn. And that's what happens in humans, is this turning of the head, the beginning of rotational birth, fitting through the pelvis. Now, it's still, look, it's still pretty tight. I'm not touching it. And so there's a tight squeeze there. So that would suggest that at the onset of bipedalism, birth mechanism changed. It became more difficult, and it involved rotation of the baby. Now in humans, that rotation of the baby causes the baby to sort of face backwards. And it means that moms, unlike other primates, can't just reach down and give birth, assist with their own births. And so in humans across the world, cross-culturally, we have midwives. We have assistants that help delivery. And I think that just based on the mechanics of how Australopithecus gave birth, that they too would have had birth assistants. And so there's this fascinating relationship between bipedal locomotion, the skeletal changes that happen, and our social behavior. I think they're all sort of tied together. So when I say, the title of my talk was How Upright Walking Made Us Human, that how is not just sort of mechanistically how it occurred, but the hows of how did we acquire our technological savviness? How do we acquire our pro-sociality? Even to some degree, our compassion and empathy, I think, can be tied back to this unusual form of locomotion.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's see. Hold on, I had a question that I was just seeing. Danielle Peltier asked, you mentioned the back similarities between Miocene apes and hominins. Are there any pelvis or lower limb similarities?
So there's a really nice paper that was done a couple of years ago looking at a femur, a 6 million year old femur from Kenya. from a hominin called Auroran tugenensis. And it looks quite human-like in many respects. And last year I had a chance to look at a cast of it, and I agree. I see signatures of bipedalism in it. So I think this species was at least capable of moving on two legs. But what this study looked at was not just how it compares to humans, so sort of forward in time, but back in time. How does it compare to the Miocene? And sure enough, it looks more like those Miocene apes than it does like a chimpanzee. And once again, I think we have to get out of this mindset that the starting point is a chimp. If you make the chimp more evolved, if you make the chimp sort of derived, right, and gorillas derived, then what was back there towards the common ancestor? How do you model it, or how do you sort of characterize it? Well, we've got fossils from the Miocene. And when they did that, they found that there are lots of similarities between some of these Miocene apes and what you see in, say, Auroran. And so, yes, I think you do see these things in the hip joint. I've worked a lot on the ankle and the foot, and the ankles of these Miocene apes, again, in some ways, not always, but in some ways, end up looking a little more hominin-like than they look like African apes. And so if we evolved from something more African ape-like, the expectation would have been that some of these Miocene things should be looking more African ape-like. And at least from the neck down, at least in some aspects of the neck down, pelvis and legs and feet, we're not seeing that quite as much. Other anatomies, yes, there are real similarities, which would indicate orthograde and maybe even suspension was happening in these animals. But I think that's the right way to think about this, is that the Miocene, I think in our field, sometimes we push the Miocene off to the side and say, well, oof, there's a lot going on there, not really sure how it pertains to human evolution. And I think that it is incredibly important. And the more we can connect that with Pleistocene hominid evolution, the better off we'll be.
Excellent, thank you. Definitely, the deeper past is still very relevant. Here's a great question from Sophie QB. When you look at a group of modern humans, there seems to be lots of variation among individuals. Do you think that there was lots of variation within members of the same species in the past too?
Yes, but maybe not to the same degree. It is a phenomenal question. And one of the things that I love to do is take advantage of the fact that there is so much variation in human gait and in human bone development. And in some ways, there's sort of relaxed selection on humans that if I'm a lousy walker, I'm not going to get picked off by a leopard. I don't think. I hope not. But so the consequences are not going to be necessarily as severe. So the strength of selection may have been relaxed a little bit on our postcranial anatomy as it pertains to our walking. So what that does is it leads to more variation. Now here's what's cool about that is you can then sample that variation across humans today and use it as your model for trying to connect bone form with function. So one of the things we did a couple of years ago was we collected footprints and gait data on a bunch of people in Boston. It was when I was working at Boston University. So we got data on about 50 people, how they walk, what their footprints look like, and then we MRI'd them. And with an MRI, you can then digitally segment out their bones and print out their bones with a 3D printer. So then you can actually have their bones and see whether the shapes of the bones of those individuals are what you would expect given the differences in how they walk and how they leave footprints and that sort of thing. And sure enough, in some ways, not in all ways, but in some ways, there were connections. There were really cool instances where bony anatomy matched what it was they were doing. And when we have that information, we can then apply that to the fossils and say, well, we know that this form is telling us about that function. And then you can apply that to the fossil record and see indeed that there were differences functionally meaningful differences in how these different hominins moved. The thing I'm really struggling with, and I hope someone can figure out, is a magnitude of intraspecific, within a species, variation. Everyone moves a little differently. Everyone has slightly different shaped bones. And where is the line between that and intraspecific differences in how we move, species to species differences? I think that there is, But again, I have to be open to the possibility that what we're sampling here is just normal variation. And so hopefully, that's a subject that people will continue to investigate in the coming years, the coming decades, to try to figure out the variation in the fossils that we're seeing.
Yeah, excellent. And like you said, before, more fossils, it'll help. The more fossils from different species we have, the more we'll be able to understand that range of variation.
Exactly.
So this is a question that follows up a little bit from the beginning of the answer to your previous question, and this is from Isabel Valero. When hominins started to walk upright, they were more vulnerable to predators. So she means after they weren't, basically when they weren't good tree climbers anymore. Yeah. Does that mean that by then they had already evolved other traits that make bipedalism an advantage for survival?
It's a great question. And sometimes I think about, okay, you fast forward to something like Homo erectus, right? And Homo erectus, there's evidence of controlled fire. There's evidence of a pretty sophisticated, stone tool construction. It wouldn't surprise me if they could wield sticks and chuck rocks, and and they were a bigger hominin. I wouldn't mess with the Homo erectus. I think they could take care of themselves just fine. And then you go back to something like an Ardipithecus 4.5 million years ago. It's got a big grasping toe, long curved fingers. It's a pretty good tree climber and can get away from predators in that manner. The group that fascinates me and has always fascinated me and continues to fascinate me is Australopithecus, where Australopithecus has these skeletal adaptations for bipedalism. They appear to differ from species to species. Could they still climb trees? Sure. They absolutely could, and probably did each night to get away from predators. But could they scramble up a tree like a chimp? Did they have the acrobatics? Did they have a grasping toe like an Ardipithecus? No, they lost those things, or their lineage maybe never had them. And yet they hadn't sort of technologically also buffered themselves against predation. So there's this 2 million year window where it's sort of like, how are we here? How in the world did we get past that very vulnerable stage in our evolution? And to me, the answers all point to social behavior. That Australopithecus, they looked out for each other. That you had lots of eyes on the horizon. If an individual got injured, they weren't left for dead. We have those, this is a fossil I told you about earlier of a femur that has a healed fracture. A healed spiral fracture of the femur. This is the kind of fracture you get when a ski accident or a bad car accident. This individual wouldn't have been able to walk for 6 weeks, and yet this is a healed fracture. So this individual survived. How in the world did that happen? Well, I can't imagine any other situation than other members of the group helping this individual maybe into a tree, bringing them food, and social support being the thing that got Australopithecus through. We talked about birth a moment ago. Again, the shape of Lucy's pelvis would suggest that birth was challenging, and the outcomes may have been better with the presence of social assistance during birth. And so to me, Australopithecus was very human-like in those kinds of behaviors, and that would have been critical for them to survive what was a really, really challenging world for them.
Cool. So I have another question that is a different line of evidence, and you will not be surprised that I am choosing to ask this question. So what are your thoughts on the role of subsistence strategies or dietary changes and their bearing on bipedal development, things like hunting, gathering, scavenging? As for running, do you believe that evolution favored endurance over speed? This is from Philip Strickland.
Philip, that's a great question. And to the last question first, yes. That all through the skeleton, what we see are adaptations for endurance over speed, because there's a trade-off. And the human skeleton, musculoskeletal system, with a few exceptions, but very much so, is one that is well equipped for endurance and poorly built for speed. In terms of subsistence, if you're interested in sort of, subsistence strategies in Homo erectus and into the Pleistocene, you have the world's expert here in Dr. Pobiner, and I think you would be better suited to answer that question. But one of the things I have been thinking about is subsistence in Australopithecus and how that pertains to bipedal locomotion. And again, being slow and being vulnerable on the landscape, I can't imagine that they were active, during dusk and dawn, right? They're probably up in a tree, staying away from those predators. They wouldn't be able to run from them. They wouldn't be able to climb a tree fast enough to get away from animals that, like a leopard that is pretty decent at getting up a tree. And so they probably sat tight during those early morning feeding times. When you go on a safari in Africa, the time to see the animals is dusk and dawn. If you go on a safari at noontime, you're not going to see anything except people. And I think if you go back 3.5 million years ago, you would see pretty much nothing except Australopithecus. I think that's when they would be out in the landscape foraging for food. And if you're an Australopithecus with predators, nearby, you can't be picky. You eat what you find. And so the evolution of dietary breath may have started at this time, and we have good evidence through the isotopes that in fact Australopithecus, not Anamensis, but when you get to Afarensis in a population we call Platyops, maybe a species even, you start to see this real dietary breath, that they're eating what they can find. And I think a lot of that has to do with, the vulnerabilities of being a biped on that landscape. So yes, I think it did affect what we eat. And we still have that today. Around the world, if it has DNA in it, humans eat it, right? We've at least tried it as a species, not as individuals, as a species. And that kind of dietary breath, I think, goes back to the beginnings of committed habitual terrestrial bipedalism, and that's Australopithecus.
That's awesome. I'm going to use that now when people ask me about the paleo diet. If it has DNA, humans eat it. I love that. So I'm going to combine two questions that are similar together for your next question, and we only have time for a few more. Madhulika Singh asks, would the development of hominin bipedalism have favored social life among hominins? And Tilak asks, what would have been their ways of communication? Would that have in any way affected the evolution of bipedalism?
Yeah, I mean, the first question, yes, I do think that they're intimately tied together. And in fact, I'll even throw this kind of nugget in there, that I don't think bipedalism could have evolved. And what I mean by this is terrestrial bipedalism. I don't think terrestrial, on the ground, walking around slow, tripping over stuff bipedalism is possible unless you have evolved from a pro-social ape. So again, we model some of our social behavior on chimpanzees, and I think there's a good reason to do that in some respects, but we're as equally related to the bonobo. And bonobos show a lot more cooperative behavior and a lot more pro-social behavior than chimpanzees do. And I think that is the kind of animal from which you could get bipedal locomotion, terrestrial bipedal locomotion off the ground, get it sort of moving and have it survive in order to overcome, again, the challenges faced by a slow biped on that landscape. And I'm sorry, what was the second part of the question?
And it was about, and I lost it because I dismissed it already.
Oh, communication.
Yes, communication, thank you.
Yeah. So all right, this is much more speculative, but I think it's kind of fun to think about, is that by moving on two legs, by not landing on our arms, if you're an animal that uses your arms for locomotion, these muscles are all contracting. The muscles of your chest and your abdomen, your shoulder are contracting as you're moving. And that can limit the sort of flexibility of your ability to sort of produce the fine sounds that we make in language. And so if you want to get a sense of, moving quadrupedally, carry something really, really, really heavy, right? And then try to talk to someone. It's not easy. You get a little grunts, right? And that's about it. And so by freeing the arms, yes, there are technological advantages, all the things, right? But it also means a reduced utilization of the upper limb muscles. And that could that could have been a foundation from which small particulate sounds were being produced by our ancestors that then eventually became the basis for language later in the genus Homo. And we do see little hints of this in other species. So one of the most communicative of the primates is the gelada. And geladas will sit and upright and eat grass, just kind of all day. Eat their grass, eat their grass, eat their grass. And they have these little chirps and little grunts and little ways to communicate to each other, in part because they're not weight bearing on their arms while they're doing that. And then think about some of the other animals that are highly communicative. Whales, for instance, are buoyant. Up in the water, they're not putting all that force on the muscles that would then impact the way air is going to move through the system that's going to ultimately be responsible for language. Now, brains are important, hyoid's important, length of the larynx is important, all these other variables, right? But I do think bipedalism plays a part.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure people will look forward to reading more about this in your book potentially. So it is 12:30, but I want to ask one more question. And this question is from Jess. I'm someone who loves learning, but definitely not a scientist. Thank you for your work. Outside of your book coming out, what other ways would you recommend the common human stay up to date on finds? And I'd love you to mention your MOOC in this context.
Sure. So Briana and I worked together on a massive open online course, MOOC, called Bipedalism X. And it came out a couple of years ago, and it's free, and anyone can go on the edX site and search for bipedalism or search for my last name, and you'll find the course. And again, it's free, and you can just engage with the material that way. There's some really wonderful books that are being written by our colleagues in our field. Agustin Fuentes has written some really wonderful books. Ian Tattersall has written classics on our science. I would check out, Lee Berger and John Hawkes' Almost Human. Sang-Yi Lee has a fabulous book called Close Encounters of the Humankind that I would recommend. And there's so many. I'm sorry if I've forgotten. There are many I've forgotten, but there are lots of really wonderful books. And then on Facebook, there's a Bioanthro News page that maybe is a good one to check out. And in addition to that, following on Twitter, following scientists. For instance, right now, Lee Berger is excavating a new site in South Africa called the 105 site, and he's posting YouTube videos giving you daily insight into what's happening. And so usually you don't find out about a fossil discovery until it's already out of the ground, studied, analyzed, published, and it can take years for that to happen. And he's showing you this is what happens in between that time. This is all the work involved in finding, identifying, and then interpreting the fossils that we find. Because you hear that expression, data speak for themselves. They don't. Data don't talk. People talk. People talk for that data. And he's showing you that process. And so I would check that out. That's Lee Berger, Berger.
Awesome, thank you. And the only other author or paleoanthropologist that I can think of is Dan Lieberman, who's written in 2013 a book called The Story of the Human Body, and actually in 2020 a book called Exercise: The Science of Physical Activity, Rest, and Health. So thank you so much, Jerry. We had so many questions we didn't get a chance to answer, and so I'm sorry for everybody whose questions we didn't get a chance to pose to Jerry, but thank you for everybody for tuning in.